The bride's white dress trembled against her legs like a captured bird as she stood before the altar in Rico, Colorado, her breath coming in sharp, visible puffs in the cold mountain air of October 1882. And the moment Reverend Caldwell asked if anyone had reason these two should not be wed, the silence that followed was broken not by objection, but by laughter. Natalie Everson had known this marriage was a mistake from the moment her father had arranged it 3 months prior, but she had never imagined the humiliation would be quite so public or so devastating. The groom, Wallace Turnbull, stood beside her with his chest puffed out like a rooster, his face already flushed with the whiskey he had been drinking since dawn. He was 42 years old, owned the largest silver mine in the San Juan Mountains, and had decided that a 20-year-old bride would be the perfect addition to his collection of fine things. The laughter started in the back pews, a rippling sound that grew louder as it moved forward through the small wooden church. Natalie felt her hands begin to shake more violently, the bouquet of late-season wildflowers quivering so badly that petals began to fall to the floor. She had been trembling since she woke that morning, her body's rebellion against what her mind knew was wrong, and now the entire town of Rico was bearing witness to her weakness. "Look at her shake," someone whispered loudly enough for half the congregation to hear, "like a leaf in a windstorm. Poor girl cannot even hold herself still for her own wedding," another voice added with cruel amusement. Wallace turned to look at her, his expression shifting from pride to irritation. "Pull yourself together, woman," he hissed under his breath, his whiskey-soaked words hitting her face like a slap. "You are embarrassing me." But Natalie could not pull herself together. The trembling had spread from her hands to her arms, her shoulders, her entire body. Her teeth chattered despite her clenched jaw. The dress her mother had sewn with such care seemed to shake independently of her body, the fabric rustling loud enough to be heard in the front rows. "Maybe she is having some kind of fit," a woman's voice suggested with false concern. "Or maybe she knows what kind of man she is marrying," another voice countered, this one male and tinged with genuine sympathy, though the speaker did not stand to offer any real help. Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat, his face reddening with the awkwardness of the situation. He was a kind man generally, but he was also a practical one who knew which side of his bread held the butter. Wallace Turnbull had donated the funds for the church's new bell tower. The Reverend would not be stopping this wedding. "Shall we continue?" Reverend Caldwell asked, directing the question primarily to Wallace. Wallace grabbed Natalie's wrist with enough force to make her gasp. "Yes, we shall continue. My bride is simply overcome with joy." The laughter grew louder at this obvious lie. Natalie felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had already given these people enough entertainment for one day. Her father sat in the front pew, his face hard and unyielding. He had made his bargain with Wallace Turnbull, trading his daughter for enough money to save his failing ranch. There would be no rescue from that quarter. The church doors opened with a bang that echoed through the small building like a gunshot. Every head turned to see who had entered, and the laughter died away into shocked silence. The man who stood in the doorway was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore dusty trail clothes and a brown leather vest, and there were silver spurs on his boots that caught the light streaming through the church windows. He was not from Rico, that much was immediately clear. Natalie had never seen him before in her life. "Pardon the interruption," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily through the church despite its quiet tone. "But I believe this wedding should not proceed." The shocked silence held for another moment before it exploded into chaos. People began talking all at once, some standing from their pews to get a better look at the intruder. Wallace's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "Who in the hell are you?" Wallace demanded, releasing Natalie's wrist to turn fully toward the stranger. "Name is Jackson Yates," the man said, moving forward down the center aisle with a confident stride that made people instinctively move out of his way. "And I am a friend to those who need one." Natalie stared at this Jackson Yates, her trembling momentarily forgotten in her confusion. She had no friends who looked like him. She had no friends who would dare interrupt Wallace Turnbull's wedding. She had no idea what was happening. Jackson reached the altar and turned to address the congregation. "I have been in Rico for 3 days now, staying quiet and listening to talk in the saloons and the general store. I have heard about Wallace Turnbull and his business dealings. I have heard about the men who have died in his mine under suspicious circumstances. I have heard about the families he has ruined and the debts he has collected with violence." "This is slander," Wallace sputtered, but his protest was weak. Several men in the congregation were nodding slowly, their faces grim. "I have also heard," Jackson continued, his eyes finding Natalie's face and holding her gaze with surprising gentleness, "about a young woman being forced into a marriage she does not want. About a father selling his daughter to save his own skin. About a bride who has been trembling with fear since sunrise." The church erupted again, this time with a different quality to the noise. Shame began to color some faces. Others looked angry at having their entertainment interrupted. Still others seemed merely curious about where this would lead. Reverend Caldwell held up his hands. "Sir, I do not know what you think you are doing, but you cannot simply walk in here and stop a wedding based on town gossip." "No," Jackson agreed, "I cannot stop it, but she can." He turned fully to Natalie, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in any face since this nightmare began. Respect. He looked at her as though she was a person capable of making her own choices, not a piece of property to be traded between men. "Miss," Jackson said, his voice dropping lower so that it was meant primarily for her ears, though in the silence of the church many others could hear as well. "You have been standing here shaking like an aspen in wind, and these people have been laughing at you. Your groom has been drinking since dawn and can barely stand straight. Your father sold you to save his ranch. None of this is what you want. None of this is who you are." Natalie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her trembling had returned with full force. Jackson extended his hand toward her, palm up, offering not taking. "You do not have to do this. You do not have to marry this man. Walk with me right now and I will take you anywhere you want to go. You can start a new life somewhere else. You can be free." "She cannot just leave," Wallace exploded, lurching forward to grab at Natalie again. "We have a contract. Her father has already accepted my money." Jackson's hand moved faster than Wallace's, catching the older man's wrist before it could close around Natalie's arm. "The lady has not spoken yet." "Let her speak." Natalie looked around the church at all the faces staring at her. These were people she had known her entire life. The same people who had just been laughing at her terror. The same people who had allowed her father to sell her like livestock. The same people who had never once offered to help her. She looked at her father, who was half standing in his pew, his face a mixture of anger and panic. He needed Wallace's money. Without it, he would lose everything. But he had already lost his daughter's love and respect. Perhaps it was time he lost his ranch as well. She looked at Wallace, whose face was twisted with rage and alcohol and entitlement. She thought about spending the rest of her life in his house, in his bed, bearing his children, enduring his temper. She thought about dying slowly inside, piece by piece, year by year. Then she looked at Jackson Yates, this stranger who had walked into her wedding for no reason she could understand and offered her freedom. Why? she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Jackson's expression softened further. "Because 3 days ago, I rode into town and saw you in the street. You were carrying groceries back to your father's house, and you looked up at the mountains with such longing in your eyes, like you were a wild thing trapped in a cage. I asked around about you, and I learned about this wedding. I thought about riding on and minding my own business. But then I thought about that look on your face, and I could not do it. Could not ride away and leave you to this fate. It was an insane reason. It was a reason that made no logical sense. It was also the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her." Natalie dropped her bouquet. The flowers hit the wooden floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Then she placed her trembling hand in Jackson's steady one. "Walk with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. Jackson's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and solid. The trembling in her hand began to ease. "You cannot do this," her father shouted, finally finding his voice. "Natalie, I forbid it." "You are my daughter." Natalie looked at him, and for the first time in her life she felt no guilt for disappointing him. "I was your daughter. Now I am just a woman making her own choice." Wallace made a move toward them, but Jackson shifted his weight subtly, and suddenly there was a gun in his other hand, drawn so quickly from its holster that most people had not even seen him reach for it. He did not point it at anyone, just held it casually at his side, but the message was clear. "The lady has made her choice," Jackson said calmly. "I suggest everyone respect that." Then he began walking backward toward the church doors, keeping his eyes on the crowd, keeping Natalie's hand firmly in his. She walked with him, her legs shaky but moving, her white dress trailing behind her like a banner of surrender or perhaps of victory. They reached the doors. Jackson pushed them open with his back, and suddenly they were outside in the cool October sunshine, the aspen trees burning gold on the mountainsides around them. A horse was tied to the hitching post, a big bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. Jackson released Natalie's hand only long enough to holster his gun and untie the horse. Then he turned to her. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she said, surprised to find that her voice was steady now. "I can ride, in that dress." She looked down at the elaborate white gown her mother had sewn, all lace and buttons and impractical beauty. Without hesitation, she grabbed a handful of the skirt and ripped it, tearing away the lower layers until the dress ended just below her knees. The sound of tearing fabric was immensely satisfying. Jackson's lips curved into the first smile she had seen from him. "That is one way to handle it." He swung into the saddle and then extended his hand down to her. She grasped it and put her foot on his in the stirrup, and he pulled her up behind him with easy strength. She settled onto the horse's back, her arms wrapping around Jackson's waist, and felt the solid warmth of him through his vest. "Where do you want to go?" he asked over his shoulder. Natalie thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Anywhere but here." Jackson touched his heels to the horse's sides, and they began to move. Behind them, the church doors burst open and people began to pour out, Wallace's voice bellowing above the others. But Jackson urged the horse into a canter, and then into a gallop, and soon the voices faded behind them. They rode hard for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and Rico, climbing higher into the mountains on trails that Jackson seemed to know despite being a stranger to the area. Natalie clung to his back, her face pressed against his shoulder, feeling the rhythm of the horse beneath them and the cold wind rushing past. When they finally slowed, they were deep in the high country, surrounded by towering peaks and thick stands of pine and aspen. The silence was profound after the chaos of the church. Jackson guided the horse to a small clearing beside a stream and dismounted, then helped Natalie down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground. All the adrenaline that had been holding her up suddenly drained away, and she found herself sitting abruptly on a fallen log, shaking again, but this time with relief rather than fear. Jackson knelt beside her, his face concerned. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said, then let out a laugh that was half sob. "I just ran away from my wedding, with a complete stranger. I must be losing my mind." "Or maybe you are finally finding it," Jackson suggested gently. She looked at him properly for the first time since leaving the church. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. There was a scar on his left cheekbone, white against his tanned skin. He looked like a man who had lived a hard life but had not let it make him hard. "Thank you," she said. "I do not even know why you did this, but thank you." Jackson sat back on his heels. "I told you why. I saw you looking at the mountains like they were freedom, and I could not leave you trapped. But you do not know me. I could be a terrible person. I could be lying and manipulating, and you just helped me escape a perfectly good marriage." "That was not a perfectly good marriage," Jackson said firmly. "That was a business transaction disguised as a wedding. And I may not know you, but I know what I saw. I know that fear. I have seen it before." There was something in his voice that made Natalie look at him more closely. "Where did you see it before?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the stream bubbling over its rocky bed. "My mother," he finally said. "She had that same look, that trapped, desperate look. My father was not a good man. He drank too much and had a temper to match. She stayed with him because she had nowhere else to go and 5 children to feed. I was the oldest. I watched her die slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the woman she had been." "I am sorry," Natalie said softly. "I was 16 when she finally passed. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I think she just gave up. After the funeral, I left home. I could not stay and watch my father pretend to mourn her. I have been moving ever since, taking work where I can find it, trying to do some good when the opportunity presents itself. And rescuing brides from unwanted weddings is part of doing good." Jackson looked at her, and his eyes held a warmth that made something flutter in Natalie's chest. "When the bride deserves rescuing, yes." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the stream and the wind in the trees. The sun was past its peak now, beginning its afternoon descent toward the western mountains. Reality was starting to settle in around Natalie's initial euphoria. "I have no money," she said quietly. "No belongings except this ruined dress. No plan for what comes next. I cannot go back to Rico. My father will never forgive me, and Wallace will make life impossible for anyone who helps me." "You do not need to go back to Rico," Jackson said. "The world is bigger than one Colorado mining town. But where will I go? What will I do?" Jackson stood and walked to his horse, digging through his saddlebags. He returned with a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to contain dried beef and biscuits. He offered both to her. "First, you eat something. You look like you have not had a proper meal in days. Then we make a plan. I have a little money saved. Enough to get you somewhere safe, set you up with a room until you can find work. Or if you have family elsewhere, I can take you to them." Natalie accepted the food gratefully, suddenly realizing she was starving. She had been too nervous to eat breakfast, and the wedding had been scheduled for 10 in the morning. It was now well past noon. "I have an aunt in Denver," she said between bites of biscuit. "My mother's sister. She never approved of my father's business dealings. She might take me in, at least temporarily." Jackson nodded. "Denver is a good option. Big enough city that you could find work if you needed to. Far enough from Rico that Wallace and your father would have trouble finding you if they even bothered to look." "Would you take me there?" Natalie asked, then felt her cheeks warm. "I know I am already asking too much of you. You have already done more than anyone else would have. But I do not think I could make it on my own. I have never traveled alone, and I have no experience with—" "I will take you to Denver," Jackson interrupted gently. "Of course I will. I would not leave you up here in the mountains alone." The relief that washed over Natalie was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you. I will repay you somehow. When I have money, when I am settled, I will find you and repay everything." "I do not want repayment," Jackson said. "I want you to be safe and free. That is enough." They rested for another hour, letting the horse graze and drink from the stream. Jackson built a small fire and made coffee, which he served to Natalie in a dented tin cup. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. The October afternoon was growing colder as the sun dropped lower. "We should keep moving," Jackson said eventually. "We can make it to the town of Dolores by nightfall if we ride steady. There is an inn there where we can stay the night. You will have your own room," he added quickly. "I will sleep in the stable with the horse if I have to." "But you need a proper bed and a hot meal." Natalie nodded, finishing the last of her coffee. She felt stronger now, more like herself than she had in months. The constant anxiety that had been her companion since her father announced her engagement to Wallace had loosened its grip on her chest. She could breathe fully for the first time in what felt like forever. They rode through the afternoon, the landscape changing around them as they descended from the high country. The aspens gave way to scrub oak and pine, and the air grew warmer. Jackson kept the pace easy, mindful that Natalie was riding behind him with no proper saddle or stirrups. As they rode, they talked. Jackson told her about the places he had been in the 12 years since he left home. Wyoming, Montana, Nevada, all through Colorado. He had worked as a ranch hand, a mine guard, a freight wagon driver, even a deputy sheriff for a brief period in a town whose name, he said, was not worth remembering. Natalie told him about growing up in Rico, about her mother who had died when she was 15, about her father's slow slide into debt and desperation. She told him about the day Wallace Turnbull had come to their ranch house with his offer, and how her father had accepted before she even knew what was happening. "Did he ever ask you what you wanted?" Jackson asked. "No," Natalie said. "I do not think it occurred to him that what I wanted mattered. In his mind, he was doing the best thing for both of us. He would keep his ranch, and I would be married to a rich man. That is supposed to be what all women want, is it not? Security and a husband who can provide." "Security is not worth much if you are miserable," Jackson observed. "And providing material things is not the same as being a good husband." "What do you think makes a good husband?" Natalie asked, genuinely curious. Jackson was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Respect, I suppose. Kindness. The ability to see your wife as a partner, not a possession. A willingness to listen and compromise. The desire to make her happy not because you own her, but because her happiness matters to you as much as your own." "That sounds like a fairy tale," Natalie said, but there was longing in her voice. "Maybe it is rare," Jackson admitted. "But rare does not mean impossible. I have seen good marriages. My uncle and his wife were happy together for 40 years before he passed. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company, treated each other with respect and affection right up until the end." "I would like that," Natalie said softly. "A partner, not a master. Someone who sees me as a person." "You deserve that," Jackson said with such conviction that Natalie felt tears prick at her eyes again. They reached Dolores as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town was small but prosperous looking, with a main street lined with businesses, and a few dozen houses spreading out from the center. The inn was a 2-story wooden building with a painted sign that read, "Mountain View Lodging." Jackson helped Natalie dismount and led his horse to the hitching post. They must have looked quite a sight, she realized. Him in his dusty trail clothes, her in a torn wedding dress with her hair falling out of its elaborate style. The innkeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes and gray hair, took one look at them and seemed to understand that questions would not be welcome. "We have 2 rooms available," she said. "One with a double bed, one with a single. Supper is included, and there is a bathing room at the end of the hall upstairs." "We will take both rooms," Jackson said, producing money from his vest pocket. "And if you could arrange a bath for the lady, we would be grateful." "Of course," the innkeeper said, handing over 2 keys. "Supper is in an hour. Just come down to the dining room when you are ready." Natalie's room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in a faded quilt and a window that looked out on the mountains. She stood at that window for a long time after the innkeeper's daughter delivered a copper tub and bucket after bucket of hot water. When she finally sank into the bath, she felt the tension of the day begin to truly dissolve. The water turned gray with trail dust, and she scrubbed at her skin until it was pink. She washed her hair 3 times, working out all the pins and combs that had held it in place for the wedding that never was. There was a dress hanging on a hook on the door when she emerged from the bath, wrapped in a towel. It was simple calico, blue with tiny white flowers, and there was a note pinned to it in a woman's handwriting. "Thought you might need this. No charge. Good luck with wherever you are going." Natalie pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger. She put on the dress, which was only slightly too big, and braided her damp hair. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the young woman looking back. Without the elaborate hairstyle and fancy dress, without the fear tightening her features, she looked younger and somehow more herself. Jackson was waiting in the hallway when she emerged. He had cleaned up as well, his face freshly shaved and his hair damp. He had changed into a clean shirt, dark blue and obviously his best. "The innkeeper gave me this dress," Natalie said, smoothing down the skirt self-consciously. "It suits you better than the wedding dress did," Jackson said. "You look comfortable." "I am," she realized. "For the first time in months, I am comfortable." Supper was beef stew with fresh bread, and Natalie ate until she thought she might burst. Jackson ate just as heartily, and they barely spoke during the meal, both too focused on the food. Afterward, they sat in the inn's small parlor with cups of coffee, listening to the crackling fire in the hearth. "We should reach Denver in about 4 days if the weather holds," Jackson said. "Maybe 5 if we take it easy. I do not want to push too hard and wear you out." "I am tougher than I look," Natalie said. Jackson's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I am beginning to realize that. You ripped apart your wedding dress and ran away from your own ceremony without hesitation. That takes courage. Or desperation," Natalie said wryly. "Sometimes those are the same thing." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The inn's other guests drifted through the parlor, nodding politely but not engaging in conversation. Eventually, Natalie felt her eyelids growing heavy. The exhaustion of the day was catching up with her. "I should sleep," she said, standing. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Jackson stood as well. "Sleep well, Natalie. You are safe here." She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at him. "Jackson, thank you again, for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I do not know how else to express what you have done for me." "You do not have to keep thanking me," Jackson said gently. "Just be happy. That is all the thanks I need." Natalie climbed the stairs to her room, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months despite the uncertainty of her future. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the events of the day. This morning, she had been preparing to marry a man she despised. Tonight she was free, traveling with a man who had asked nothing of her except the chance to help. She fell asleep thinking about Jackson's storm-gray eyes and the way his hand had felt holding hers, steady and sure and safe. They left Dolores at dawn, after a breakfast of eggs and bacon and more of the inn's good coffee. Jackson had purchased some supplies, including a proper split skirt for Natalie that would make riding easier. She changed into it gratefully, already feeling more prepared for the journey ahead. The ride to Denver would take them north through varied terrain, crossing from the high San Juan Mountains into the flatter lands to the east. Jackson knew the route well, having traveled it several times before. He pointed out landmarks as they rode, keeping up a steady stream of conversation that kept Natalie's mind off the soreness developing in her legs and back. On the second day, they stopped in a small settlement that was barely more than a crossroads with a general store. Jackson bought dried fruit and jerky for the trail, and the store owner's wife sold them fresh bread still warm from the oven. They ate lunch sitting on a fallen log at the edge of town, watching clouds build over the mountains. "Tell me about your aunt," Jackson said between bites of bread and cheese. "The one in Denver, do you think she will take you in?" Natalie considered the question carefully. "I think so. She and my mother were close before Mama married my father. After the wedding, they saw each other less. My aunt did not approve of how he treated my mother, always making decisions without consulting her, spending money they did not have on schemes that never worked out. But Aunt Catherine always sent me birthday gifts and letters. The last letter I got from her was about 6 months ago. She was teaching at a school for girls in Denver, living in a boarding house run by a widow. Teaching is good, honest work," Jackson said. "And if she has connections at a school, she might be able to help you find a position there too." "I would like that," Natalie said. "I enjoy children. I used to help teach Sunday school back in Rico before everything fell apart." "What else do you enjoy?" Jackson asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice as though her interests actually mattered to him. "Reading," Natalie said immediately. "Any book I can get my hands on. Poetry, novels, histories, everything. I like walking in the mountains, especially in the early morning when everything is quiet. I like baking bread and watching the dough rise. I like the sound of rain on a roof and the smell of pine trees after a storm." She paused, slightly embarrassed. "That probably sounds silly." "It sounds like you pay attention to the world around you," Jackson said. "That is not silly at all. Most people go through life half asleep, never noticing the small, beautiful things." "What about you?" Natalie asked. "What do you enjoy?" Jackson leaned back against the log, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Riding through open country with no particular destination in mind. The feeling of a good horse beneath me and wind in my face. Coffee at sunrise. A well-made saddle and a reliable gun. Stars so thick you cannot see the black between them." He glanced at her. "And good conversation with interesting people." "Am I interesting?" Natalie asked before she could stop herself. "Very," Jackson said seriously. "You are brave and thoughtful and surprisingly funny for someone who just escaped a terrible situation. You have not complained once about the long riding or the uncertainty of your future. You notice things, like I said. You are interesting." Natalie Everson. Natalie felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She looked at Jackson's profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way his hair curled slightly at his collar, and felt something shift inside her. Attraction, she realized. She was attracted to this man who had rescued her, this stranger who treated her with more respect and kindness than her own father had. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They reached a small town called Ridgway on the third day. It was larger than the settlements they had passed through, with a proper hotel and several restaurants. Jackson suggested they stay the night in real beds and have a proper hot meal that neither of them had to cook over a campfire. The hotel was nice, nicer than the inn in Dolores, with carpeted floors and wallpapered walls. Natalie's room had a real wardrobe and a washstand with a porcelain basin. After cleaning up, she came downstairs to find Jackson waiting in the lobby, looking uncomfortable in his clean shirt and vest, clearly not a man used to fancy hotels. "There is a restaurant down the street that is supposed to have excellent steak," he said, "if you are hungry." "I am always hungry lately," Natalie admitted. "I think it is all the riding." The restaurant was warm and bustling with evening customers. They sat at a small table near the window, and Jackson ordered steak for both of them with all the accompaniments. While they waited for their food, Natalie found herself studying his hands where they rested on the table. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living, but they had been gentle when he helped her onto his horse, careful when he handed her down. "You are staring," Jackson observed with amusement. Natalie felt her cheeks heat. "Sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how different you are from Wallace, from my father, from most of the men I have known." Jackson's expression grew serious. "How so? You listen when I talk. You ask about my interests and opinions. You treat me like my thoughts matter. Wallace never asked me a single question about myself in the 3 months we were engaged. He talked about his mine and his business deals and his plans for expanding his holdings, but he never once asked what I wanted or what I thought about anything." "Then Wallace is a fool," Jackson said firmly. "Any man lucky enough to have your attention should be hanging on your every word." The intensity in his voice made Natalie's breath catch. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something she did not quite know how to name. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of their food, enormous steaks with potatoes and vegetables and fresh rolls. They ate and talked about easier things. The people they had seen on the trail, the changing weather, the towns they would pass through on their way to Denver. But underneath the casual conversation, Natalie felt that same charged awareness. She found herself noticing details about Jackson she had not consciously registered before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh, the precise way he cut his food. After dinner, they walked slowly back to the hotel through the cooling evening. The streets were quieter now, most people already home for the night. Overhead, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "We should reach Denver by tomorrow afternoon if we leave early," Jackson said as they stood in the hotel lobby. "You will be with your aunt soon, safe and settled." There was something in his voice that sounded almost sad, and Natalie realized with a start that their journey was nearly over. Once they reached Denver, once she was safely delivered to her aunt, Jackson would leave. He would ride away and she would never see him again. The thought made her chest tighten with unexpected pain. "Jackson," she said, then hesitated, not sure what she wanted to say. He looked at her, waiting patiently, giving her time to find the words. "I do not want this to be the end," she finally said. "Of our acquaintance, I mean. When we reach Denver, I would like to know where you are going next, in case I need to reach you. To repay you," she added quickly, though they both knew that was not the real reason. Jackson studied her face for a long moment. "I had been planning to head north toward Wyoming. There is ranch work available there this time of year, preparing herds for winter. But I could stay in Denver for a while. Make sure you are truly settled before I move on." "You do not have to do that," Natalie said, even as relief flooded through her. "I know I do not have to," Jackson said softly, "but I would like to, if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Natalie whispered. They stood there in the hotel lobby, looking at each other, and Natalie thought Jackson might be about to say something more. But then the hotel clerk coughed politely, reminding them they were not alone, and the moment passed. "Good night, Natalie," Jackson said. "Good night," she replied, and climbed the stairs to her room with her heart beating faster than the exertion warranted. She lay in bed that night, unable to sleep despite her tiredness. She kept replaying moments from the past 3 days. Jackson's hand reaching out to her at the altar, his voice telling her she deserved freedom, his eyes on her face during their conversations. She thought about how safe she felt with him, how comfortable, how he made her laugh even in the midst of upheaval, how he never tried to control her or tell her what to do, only offered options and let her choose. She was falling in love with him. The realization came softly, inevitably, like the sunrise. She was falling in love with Jackson Yates, and she had no idea if he felt the same way. They left Ridgway before dawn, both of them quiet and thoughtful. The final leg of their journey took them out of the mountains and into the rolling hills that surrounded Denver. The landscape opened up, the towering peaks giving way to broader vistas. They could see the city from miles away, a sprawl of buildings against the base of the mountains. As they drew closer, Natalie felt anxiety begin to replace the anticipation. What if her aunt would not take her in? What if she had moved, or worse, what if she took her father's side and sent Natalie back to Rico? What if she and Jackson reached Denver, and then he decided to ride north immediately, disappearing from her life as quickly as he had entered it? "You are thinking too hard," Jackson said, glancing back at her. "I can practically hear your thoughts from here." "I am nervous," Natalie admitted. "About what comes next?" "That is understandable. You are starting over in a new place, but you are strong, Natalie. You proved that when you put your hand in mine and walked out of that church. Whatever comes next, you can handle it." His confidence in her steadied her somewhat. They rode into Denver in the late afternoon, the streets busy with wagons and pedestrians and horses. The city was much larger than Rico, more alive and energetic. Natalie felt both intimidated and excited by it. Jackson found a stable to board his horse, and then hired a carriage to take them to the address Natalie remembered from her aunt's last letter. The boarding house was in a respectable neighborhood, a 3-story brick building with lace curtains in the windows and a small garden in front. Natalie stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house, suddenly frozen with uncertainty. Jackson stepped beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Would you like me to come with you?" he asked. "Yes," Natalie said gratefully. "Please." They climbed the steps together, and Jackson knocked on the door. It was opened by a middle-aged woman in a neat black dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. "May I help you?" the woman asked, her eyes taking in their dusty travel clothes with obvious disapproval. "We are looking for Catherine Ellis," Natalie said. "I believe she boards here." "Miss Ellis is in the parlor," the woman said, her tone softening slightly. "Who shall I say is calling? Tell her Natalie Everson is here to see her." The woman's eyebrows rose, but she stepped back to let them enter. "Wait here, please." They stood in the narrow hallway, and Natalie felt her heart pounding. A moment later, a woman appeared from a doorway down the hall, moving quickly, her face a mixture of shock and joy. "Natalie." "Good heavens, child, is it really you?" Catherine Ellis was in her early 40s, with auburn hair streaked with gray and warm brown eyes that looked exactly like Natalie's mother's eyes. She wore a simple gray dress and had ink stains on her fingers, as though she had been interrupted in the middle of writing. "Aunt Catherine," Natalie said, and suddenly she was crying, all the fear and stress and relief of the past days overwhelming her at once. Catherine pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding her tightly. "What has happened? "Why are you here? Is everything all right? Can we speak privately?" Natalie asked, pulling back and wiping at her eyes. Catherine's gaze shifted to Jackson, questioning but not hostile. "Of course. Come up to my rooms, both of you." She led them upstairs to a comfortable suite consisting of a sitting room and a bedroom. Books were everywhere, stacked on tables and shelves, and there was a desk covered with papers. Catherine gestured them to sit, and then took a chair facing them. "Now," she said firmly, "tell me what has brought you to Denver looking like you have been traveling hard for days." Natalie told the story, with Jackson occasionally adding details. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: anger, sadness, pride, and finally determination. "Your father sold you to Wallace Turnbull," she said when Natalie finished. "That sounds exactly like something Robert would do. He always did put his own needs first." "I could not marry Wallace," Natalie said. "I know I have disappointed my father, and I know he needed the money, but I could not do it." "You should not have had to do it," Catherine said firmly. She turned to Jackson. "And you stopped the wedding and brought her here." "Why?" Jackson met her gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do." "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing," Jackson said simply. "I just wanted her to be safe and free to make her own choices." Catherine studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you. Which makes you unusual among men in my experience." She turned back to Natalie. "Of course you can stay here, for as long as you need. I have been hoping for years that you would leave that situation in Rico. I just wish I had known it had gotten so bad. I would have come for you myself." Relief made Natalie dizzy. "Thank you. I will work. I will earn my keep. Jackson mentioned you teach at a school. Perhaps there is a position available, or I could find work elsewhere." "We will figure all that out," Catherine said. "First, you need rest and a proper wardrobe and time to recover from this ordeal. Mrs. Henderson, who runs this boarding house, is a friend. She will not object to you staying in my spare room temporarily." It was decided so quickly that Natalie barely had time to process it. She had a place to stay. Her aunt welcomed her with open arms. She was truly free of her father and Wallace and the terrible future she had been facing. Jackson stood. "I should go find myself lodgings. Let you two spend time together." "Wait," Natalie said, standing as well. "Aunt Catherine, would you excuse us for a moment?" Catherine looked between them, her expression knowing. "Of course. I need to speak with Mrs. Henderson anyway about the arrangements. Take your time." She left, closing the door behind her. Natalie and Jackson stood facing each other in the small sitting room, and suddenly Natalie did not know what to say. There was so much she wanted to tell him, but the words tangled in her throat. "Thank you," she finally said, knowing it was inadequate but not knowing how else to begin. "For everything. For saving me, for bringing me here safely, for asking nothing in return. I do not know what would have happened if you had not walked into that church." "You would have found another way out," Jackson said. "You are stronger than you think, Natalie. Maybe. But I am glad I did not have to do it alone." They were standing close enough that Natalie could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to him. "You said you were planning to stay in Denver for a while," she said. "Did you mean that?" "I did," Jackson confirmed. "I want to make sure you are truly settled before I move on." "And after that?" Natalie asked, her heart in her throat. "After I am settled, you will just ride north and I will never see you again." Jackson's hand came up slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. He touched her cheek with his fingertips, the gentlest of contacts. "Would it bother you if I did? Ride away and never come back?" "Yes," Natalie whispered. "It would bother me very much." "Why?" Jackson asked, his voice equally soft. "Because somewhere between that altar and here I fell in love with you," Natalie said, the words coming out in a rush. I know it is foolish and too fast and probably just gratitude confused with something else, but I cannot help how I feel. And I thought you should know before you decide whether to stay or go. Jackson's entire face transformed, a smile spreading across it that made him look years younger. Natalie Everson, you are the bravest woman I have ever met. And for the record, it is not foolish or too fast, and it is definitely not just gratitude, because I fell in love with you too. You did, Natalie breathed. I did. I think it started that first day, when I saw you in the street looking at the mountains like they held all your dreams. It grew when I saw you trembling in that church, but still standing, still trying to be brave. And it became certain when you ripped apart your wedding dress without hesitation and climbed onto my horse like you were riding toward freedom instead of away from everything you had ever known. So what do we do now? Natalie asked. Now, Jackson said, his hand still cradling her cheek. I stay in Denver. I find work here, something stable. I court you properly, the way you deserve to be courted. I meet your aunt and convince her I am worthy of your time. And when enough time has passed that you are certain of your feelings, when you have had the chance to heal from everything you went through and start your new life, I ask you to marry me, if you want that. I want that, Natalie said, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of joy. I want all of that. Jackson leaned forward slowly, giving her time to refuse, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then that is what we will do. No rushing, no pressure. We will do this right, Natalie. I promise you that. A knock at the door made them step apart. Catherine entered, took one look at their faces, and smiled. I see you two have things figured out. Mr. Yates, there is a boarding house 2 streets over that takes male lodgers. Clean rooms and reasonable rates. I can give you directions. Thank you, Miss Ellis, Jackson said. I appreciate that. He turned to Natalie. I will come by tomorrow afternoon if that is acceptable. Perhaps we could take a walk and you could show me Denver. I have never been to Denver before either, Natalie pointed out with a laugh. Then we will explore it together, Jackson said. Discover it at the same time. After Jackson left, Catherine sat Natalie down and had a long talk with her about being careful with her heart, about taking time to heal, about not jumping from one man to another out of desperation or gratitude. Natalie listened patiently and then assured her aunt that she understood all of that, but that what she felt for Jackson was real and true and worth pursuing. He could have asked anything of me, Natalie said. On the trail, we camped alone together, and he was a perfect gentleman. He has shown me nothing but respect and kindness. He has not tried to control me or tell me what to do. He saved me from a terrible situation and asked nothing in return. That is not the behavior of a man who is trying to take advantage. Catherine sighed. No, I suppose it is not. And I saw the way he looked at you like you were something precious. That is not something a man can fake. Very well, I will not stand in your way, but I will be watching him, and if he hurts you, I will make him regret it. Fair enough, Natalie said, hugging her aunt. The next weeks passed in a blur of new experiences and growing happiness. Natalie moved into Catherine's spare room and began helping her aunt with her teaching. Catherine taught at a private school for girls, instructing them in literature and composition. She introduced Natalie to the headmistress, who offered her a position as an assistant teacher starting in the new year. Meanwhile, Jackson found work with a freight company, managing their stables and occasionally making runs to nearby towns when they needed an experienced rider. It was steady work with decent pay, and it kept him in Denver. True to his word, Jackson courted Natalie properly. He called on her at the boarding house, always at appropriate hours. They took walks through Denver's streets, exploring the growing city together. He took her to concerts and lectures. bought her books from the shops downtown, and listened with genuine interest as she talked about her work with the students. He met her aunt's scrutiny with patience and honesty, answering Catherine's pointed questions about his past and his intentions without resentment. Gradually, Catherine warmed to him, especially after she saw how happy Natalie was in his presence. The first time Jackson kissed Natalie properly was in late November, nearly 6 weeks after they arrived in Denver. They had been walking through a park near the boarding house, the trees bare and a light snow falling. Natalie had been laughing at something he said when he suddenly stopped walking and turned to face her. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his breath misting in the cold air. "Yes," Natalie said, her heart racing. The kiss was sweet and gentle and perfect, his lips warm against hers despite the cold. When they pulled apart, Natalie felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "I love you," Jackson said, not for the first time but with such conviction that it made her eyes sting with happy tears. "I love you too," she replied. Winter settled over Denver, and Natalie's new life took shape. She taught at the school and discovered she was good at it, patient and creative in her methods. The girls adored her, and the headmistress praised her work. She made friends among the other teachers and began to build a community in this new city. Jackson became a fixture in her life, steady and reliable. He took her to meet his friends from the freight company, and she hosted a dinner at the boarding house where Jackson charmed Mrs. Henderson and made Catherine laugh with his stories. He fit into her life seamlessly, as though he had always been meant to be there. On Christmas Eve, Jackson asked Natalie to marry him. They were in Catherine's sitting room with Catherine herself present as chaperone, drinking mulled cider and watching snow fall outside the window. Jackson got down on one knee in the traditional manner, producing a simple gold ring that he said had belonged to his mother. "Natalie Everson," he said, "you are the bravest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man. You make me believe in the possibility of happiness and home. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Natalie said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." Catherine applauded and produced a bottle of champagne she had been saving for just such an occasion. They toasted to the future, to love, to new beginnings. The wedding took place in April 1883 in a small church in Denver with Catherine and a handful of friends in attendance. This time, Natalie wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried wildflowers. This time, she walked down the aisle toward a man she loved, a man who loved her back, a man who had given her freedom and then asked her to choose him. This time, her hands were steady. Jackson waited for her at the altar with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected to this union, the silence was peaceful and welcoming. When Jackson said, "I do," his voice was strong and sure. When Natalie said, "I do," she meant it with every fiber of her being. They kissed as husband and wife for the first time, and the small congregation applauded. Catherine hugged them both fiercely, whispering to Natalie that her mother would have been so proud of her. After the wedding, there was a small reception at a restaurant downtown. Jackson's friends from the freight company attended, along with some of Natalie's fellow teachers. It was a joyful, intimate celebration, nothing like the grand spectacle her wedding to Wallace would have been. As the afternoon wore into evening, Jackson pulled Natalie aside onto a small balcony overlooking the street. The spring air was cool but pleasant, and the mountains were visible in the distance, snow still capping their peaks. "Mrs. Yates," Jackson said, testing out her new name. "How does that sound?" "Perfect," Natalie said. "Everything about this is perfect." "I got you something," Jackson said, producing a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "A wedding gift." Natalie unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. "For your stories," Jackson explained. "Catherine told me you used to write when you were younger before everything happened with your father. I thought you might want to start again." Natalie clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. This is wonderful." "We have a good life ahead of us," Jackson said, pulling her close. "I promise you that. I will work hard and treat you well. We will have a home together, maybe children if we are blessed. We will be partners, Natalie, equals. That is my vow to you." "And mine to you," Natalie said. "Partners and equals. Forever." They had rented a small house on the outskirts of Denver, close enough to the city that Natalie could continue teaching but far enough out that they had a bit of land. It was modest but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with a good stove. Jackson had spent the past month fixing it up, painting walls and repairing loose boards, making it into a home for them. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager. Jackson was patient and gentle, making sure Natalie felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay in bed talking until dawn, making plans for their future. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Natalie's life. She continued teaching, growing more confident in her abilities. Jackson's work with the freight company expanded, and his boss offered him a supervisor position with better pay. They bought furniture for their house piece by piece, building a home together. In the summer, they took a trip into the mountains, camping under the stars the way Jackson had done for years. He taught Natalie to fish and to read the sky for weather changes. She taught him some of the poetry she loved, reading to him by firelight. In the fall, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. She told Jackson over dinner, watching his face transform from confusion to shock to pure joy. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and apologized, afraid he had hurt the baby. "The baby is fine," Natalie laughed. "I am fine. We are all fine." Their daughter was born in May 1884, a healthy baby girl with Jackson's gray eyes and Natalie's dark hair. They named her Rose Catherine, after the flowers Natalie had been carrying when she fled her first wedding and after the aunt who had given her sanctuary. Catherine was a devoted aunt, visiting often and showering Rose with love and gifts. She retired from teaching when Rose was a year old, moving into a cottage near Natalie and Jackson's house so she could help with childcare. 2 years later, a son arrived, whom they named Thomas James. He had his mother's brown eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Their house rang with the sounds of children playing, of laughter and life and love. Jackson proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful. He taught Rose to ride when she was 5, holding her steady in the saddle just as he had once held Natalie. He showed Thomas how to whittle when the boy was old enough to hold a knife safely. He read to them every night, even when he was exhausted from work. Natalie balanced teaching with motherhood, sometimes bringing her children to the school during holidays when they could not be left at home. The students loved having babies to fuss over, and Rose and Thomas grew up surrounded by books and learning. They never returned to Rico. Natalie's father sent one letter after she left, demanding she return and make things right with Wallace. She wrote back saying she was married, happy, and never coming back. After that, she heard nothing more from him. She made peace with losing him, understanding that he had lost her first when he chose money over his daughter's well-being. Years passed, peaceful and full. Jackson's mother's ring stayed on Natalie's finger, growing worn and comfortable. They added a 3rd child to their family, another daughter they named Grace. The house expanded, rooms added as the family grew. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Natalie back to Rico. Not to stay, just to visit. They rode together on 2 horses this time, traveling as equals just as they had promised. They stopped at the church where their story had begun, now looking smaller and less imposing than Natalie remembered. "You regret any of it?" Jackson asked as they stood outside the church. "The pain you went through, the break with your father, all of it." Natalie thought about the question seriously. "I regret that it had to happen the way it did," she said. "I regret that my father could not be a better man. But do I regret that it led me to you? Never. Not for a single moment." "I walked into this church 10 years ago," Jackson said, "and I saw you trembling like an aspen leaf. I saw the fear in your eyes and the way everyone was mocking you, and I knew I could not let you go through with it. Best decision I ever made." "Walking out of that church with you was the best decision I ever made," Natalie countered. They did not go inside. They had no need to revisit that particular memory in detail. Instead, they remounted their horses and rode up into the mountains, finding a meadow full of wildflowers where they had lunch and talked about their children and their lives and their future. When they returned to Denver, Rose ran out to meet them, now a bright 10-year-old with scraped knees and wild curly hair. Thomas was right behind her, 8 years old and talking a mile a minute about the fort he had been building with Catherine's help. Grace, at 5, toddled after her siblings, determined to keep up. Jackson lifted Rose into his arms despite her protests that she was too old for such things. Thomas wrapped himself around his father's leg. Grace demanded to be picked up by her mother. Catherine stood on the porch of their house, smiling at the chaos. This was Natalie's life now. This love, this family, this home. All because one day a cowboy had walked into a church and offered his hand to a trembling bride, and she had been brave enough to take it. As the sun set over the mountains that evening, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Natalie stood on her porch with Jackson's arm around her waist and their children playing in the yard. She thought about the girl she had been, trapped and terrified, and the woman she had become, free and loved. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About how grateful I am," Natalie said, "for that October day in 1882 when you walked into my life. For your courage and your kindness, for everything that came after." "I am the grateful one," Jackson said. "You gave me a reason to stop wandering, a reason to build a life instead of just passing through other people's lives. You gave me a home, Natalie. You gave me everything." They stood together as darkness fell, watching their children play, listening to Catherine laugh at something Rose said. Inside the house, lamps glowed warm and welcoming. Dinner was waiting, and after dinner would come stories and songs and the comfortable rituals of family life. Years later, when Rose was preparing for her own wedding, she asked her mother about that day in Rico, about the wedding that never was and the stranger who had offered rescue. "Were you not afraid?" Rose asked. "Going off with a man you did not know, leaving everything behind?" Natalie considered her answer carefully. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I was more afraid of the life I would have if I stayed. Sometimes the scariest thing is also the right thing, and your father made me feel safe from the very beginning. Not because he told me to trust him, but because he showed me through his actions that I could." "How did you know you loved him?" Rose asked. "I knew I loved him when I realized that he saw me as a person, not as property. When I understood that he valued my thoughts and feelings and choices. When I saw that he would rather have me happy and free than bound to him out of obligation or gratitude. Love is not just a feeling, Rose. It is a choice to see the other person clearly and to cherish who they truly are." Rose hugged her mother tightly. "I hope I find what you and Papa have." "I hope you do too," Natalie said. "And I hope you are brave enough to reach for it when it comes." Jackson entered the room then, older now with silver threading through his dark hair, but still strong and vital. He wrapped his arms around both Natalie and Rose, pressing kisses to the tops of their heads. "What are my girls conspiring about?" he asked. "Love and bravery," Rose said. "The two things your mother has in abundance," Jackson said, winking at Natalie. The day of Rose's wedding was bright and clear. Nothing like that cold October day in Rico so many years before. Rose walked down the aisle steady and sure, her eyes only for the young man waiting for her at the altar, a good man whom she had chosen freely, whom she loved deeply. Natalie cried happy tears, Jackson's hand solid and warm in hers. Thomas grew into a fine young man who chose to work with his father in the freight business, eventually taking it over and expanding it into a successful regional operation. Grace became a teacher like her mother and aunt, working at the same school where Natalie had started her Denver life. Catherine lived to be 73, surrounded by the family she had helped create. Her last words to Natalie were, "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you became." Jackson and Natalie grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, their house always full of children and noise and life. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, hands clasped, comfortable in the silence of two people who had walked through life as true partners. 50 years after that October day in Rico, Jackson and Natalie celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family. Jackson, now 73, still had mischief in his gray eyes. Natalie, at 70, still had grace and strength in every movement. "Tell us the story again," their youngest great-grandchild begged. "About how you met." So they told it, as they had told it countless times over the years, Jackson and Natalie trading off parts of the narrative. The story of a trembling bride and a courageous cowboy. The story of a town that mocked and a man who offered his hand. The story of a walk toward freedom that became a journey toward love. "Walk with me," Jackson said to Natalie that evening after the party had ended, and they were alone in their bedroom, the same room they had shared for half a century. "Always," Natalie replied, taking his hand just as she had taken it that day in the church, steady and sure and certain. They had walked together through 50 years of life, through joy and sorrow, through triumph and struggle. They had built a family together, a home together, a love that had withstood the test of time. And they would walk together for whatever days remained, hand in hand, two souls who had found each other against all odds and had chosen each other every day since. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the dramatic rescue or the town's mockery or the escape from a terrible fate. What mattered was the choice they had made to love each other, to build a life together, to be partners and equals and best friends. What mattered was the 50 years of daily decisions to choose love, to choose kindness, to choose each other. Jackson Yates and Natalie Everson Yates lived out their days in that house in Denver, surrounded by love and family, their story becoming legend in their family. The story of how a brave young woman put her hand in a stranger's hand and walked away from everything she knew toward a future she could not predict. The story of how a good man kept his promises and built a life worthy of the brave woman who had trusted him. When Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Natalie grieved deeply, but not bitterly. She had been blessed with 55 years of the best marriage imaginable. She had his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She had a lifetime of happy memories. She lived another 7 years after Jackson's death, surrounded by family, still teaching occasional classes, still writing in journals, still walking in the mountains when the weather was fine. When her time came, she went peacefully, a smile on her face, Jackson's mother's ring still on her finger. They were buried side by side in a cemetery overlooking the mountains, their gravestones simple and elegant. Jackson and Natalie Yates, partners in life and in love, they walked together. Their story lived on through their descendants, told and retold at family gatherings. The story of courage and love, of choosing freedom over security, of trusting a stranger who proved to be the answer to every prayer. The story that started with a trembling bride and ended with a love that transcended even death. In Rico, the old church still stood, though it was no longer used for services. Someone had turned it into a museum of local history, and among the exhibits was a section about Wallace Turnbull, who had died in a mine accident 5 years after Natalie left, his business empire collapsing around him. Robert Everson had lost his ranch anyway, dying alone and bitter. But in Denver, the Yates family thrived across generations, a testament to the power of one moment of courage, one extended hand, one choice to walk toward love instead of succumbing to fear. The story of Natalie and Jackson became more than just a family legend. It became a reminder that sometimes the scariest choice is the right choice. That freedom is worth fighting for. That love, real love, respects and cherishes rather than controls and diminishes. That partnerships built on equality and mutual respect can withstand anything life throws at them. And it all started with 5 simple words spoken by a cowboy to a terrified bride in a small Colorado church in October 1882. "Walk with me." She had walked with him, and it had made all the difference.